Hi, today we're going to talk about price ceilings, price floors, and quotas. Ultimately policies that governments put in to limit either the price or the quantity that's available to the market in some form. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at price floors and price ceilings. But before we do that, I want you to repeat after me. I look down at the ceiling, I look up at the floor. Repeat. I look down at the ceiling, I look up at the floor. Okay? Now, why am I telling you that? Because I want you to be able to draw out this pattern for a price ceiling and price floor accurately on this set. A price ceiling is a government policy that sets a maximum price on a set of goods. You will set the price at this level, but no higher. Now, this is what that looks like, is that we put a price ceiling below equilibrium. In other words, up here, but I'm looking down here, okay? So I look down at the ceiling, I look up at the floor. So price ceilings, for be effective, have to be below equilibrium. And that key part is important because they can ask you if ultimately you have a price ceiling above equilibrium, how effective it is. And the answer to that is that it's not. It has to be below equilibrium in this case. So one of the things that you should notice right away is this solid line. In one of the last videos I did on equilibrium, we were talking about shortages and surpluses. We were using dotted lines. To get rid of a shortage or surplus, you just simply change the price. This is a solid line because it indicates a barrier that you cannot go above this price. Why? Because we're talking about a government policy. Government policies are laws, regulations, things that ultimately are established for public order in some form. So you cannot go above this price by law, if you will. Now, if you notice, if we can't go below this price, then that means instantly a price ceiling will always create a shortage. And it's going to be a persistent shortage of the good. So we already have one problem with this, it's right away. Second, the wrong buyer buys the good. Now, how is that possible? Think about this in terms of, say, Tickle Me Elmo. All right. Let's say you've got a kid who really loves Tickle Me Elmo, just an adorable little plush doll that it is. Okay. And you got another kid who basically likes to tear apart his toys and plans on ripping the head off Tickle Me Elmo, shoving it on a pipe to serve as an example to the other dolls of what happens when they step out of line. Now, it's a good bet that the kid who wants the doll and really loves this thing, he probably has a higher demand for it, which means he'd be willing to pay a higher price. That's a problem when you get to this. Let's say that both of them go after this toy at the same time, and it just so happens by luck of the draw, the kid who wants to destroy the toy, he gets there first, and he buys it. That's a real problem, okay? Because the kid who probably wanted it would have been willing to pay that higher price. And incidentally, the seller's going to lose out too. The seller would love to sell at this price, but they're stuck selling it down here. So it's a lose-lose for everybody except the kid who's a little scary, all right? Wasted resources. Now, this can take a variety of things, but in the case of price ceiling, the wasted resource we're really worried about is time. That kid who's looking for the Tickle Me Elmo, because of the shortage, he's having to travel all over the place to find this Tickle Me Elmo. Can't find one, at least not easily. So time is certainly wasted there. Low quality. Let's say that Tickle Me Elmo costs, $50 a pop in terms of, the what I can make on that end. But I got a price ceiling that basically says, you can't sell it higher than $20. You better believe I'm going to cut the quality of the materials to make that. That toy is going to be filled with sawdust and everything else I can put in there to make sure that I make a profit. And incidentally, that's okay in terms of, economic theory. Of course, it's a bad idea. We don't want toys filled with sawdust. But that's kind of a problem with this. I have no incentive to ultimately produce this price. So in order for me to do so, I essentially have to lower my cost, which means the quality of materials is going to go down. Finally, black markets. Black markets are often misunderstood because we think of it as James Bond, we're going to sell nuclear weapons, that kind of thing, okay? In reality, what a black market is a secondary goods market, all right? If I have a Tickle Me Elmo that I got, at $25 a piece, okay? Great, I have access to the good, but I have some extra. So why not turn around and sell them for $50 a piece? Well, in a product that's controlled by price ceiling, generally that's not fair. Government doesn't like it when essentially you benefit from them and then you turn around and get a second benefit for yourself. That's not going to work. So black markets are oftentimes one of the problems that comes up with this. So why why is this even an issue? Why in the world would we do this? These are just some of the problems that we come up with price ceilings. The answer, ultimately, as a good example, is rent control. All right. If we were to take, say, somebody who works at Starbucks, in the middle of Manhattan, say Times Square, and let's say generously they make $15 an hour, and that they work 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, assuming no, benefits, that comes out to roughly $31,000 and change, I think. You can do the math on your own on that. But understand something, that $31,000 and change is not nearly enough. Okay? The average rent for a studio apartment in Manhattan is a much higher price overall. There's no way they could afford to live there. So if that's the case, they're going to live up in Albany, 2.5 hours north. So they're going to commute one way or the other. Okay, so what? All right? They're going to commute. No big deal, right? It's just a Starbucks guy. I'm going to tell you right now, my cat's going to show up in some of these videos. He's going to whine. Ignore him. All right? The Starbucks guy, again, who cares? They just, they're not that important, right? You have to understand that cities like New York, like Paris, like London, these are cities that ultimately have some kind of microcosm of national economies. And national economies don't work if you don't have a variety of jobs. Not everybody can be a lawyer, a doctor, a stockbroker. The world does actually need ditch diggers and coffee baristas and everything else along those lines. So we have to have that variety. We have to encourage that guy to live here. And that's where we come up with an idea called rent control. Put this another way. That guy that we said would ultimately commute 2.5 hours away from Albany to New York to work every day, if he had to do that, guess what that guy's going to end up doing? He's going to move to Albany and find a job up there. So what New York has done, and other cities as well, is they have placed price ceilings on certain apartments so that people who couldn't otherwise afford to live in that city can actually do that. Does that create a whole host of problems? Sure, it does. Somebody might be willing to pay more for an apartment than otherwise. And yes, in the past, we've had some problems with landlords putting low quality, materials into apartments and stuff like that. But the other option is essentially to have huge missing parts in our economy. We'll get more to that idea in a minute. Price floors. Okay. Price floors are essentially government policies that set a minimum price on a set of goods. All right. So in this case, we're going to benefit producers. Now remember, I look down at the ceiling, I look up at the floor. The price floor, in order for it to be effective, has to be above equilibrium. And yes, they can and will ask a question, putting a price floor down here and asking about its effectiveness. Down here, it's ineffective. It's got to be up here for this to be effective for producers. So this also causes some problems because remember, like before when we were talking about equilibrium, this automatically creates a surplus. But unlike before, we can't get rid of this surplus because this is government policy that sets the price higher on this end. Second, the wrong seller gets to sell the good. It's the luck of the draw problem that we actually saw over here with price ceilings. Let's say you've got two sellers to Tickle Me Elmos, and you've got a guy who's, trying to get them. He has a choice between store A, store B. They're literally equidistant, equal value, equal price, and everything. He just chooses store B, gets the sale. The guy who ultimately owns store A might have been willing to sell it at a cheaper price, but he can't because of that. And incidentally, the buyer loses out as well because they might have been willing to, and certainly would have preferred to pay this price than ultimately this price, but they can't. So the wrong seller can end up selling the good in this case. Wasted resources. In this case, we're talking about actual land, labor, capital, on this thing. Think about if we put a price floor on a gallon of milk. Okay. Well, according to this, we're going to produce a whole heck of a lot of stuff. A whole lot of milk. I can't drink that much milk, and neither can apparently these consumers over here. So you're going to see a lot of wasted stuff, a lot of wasted products, and a lot of wasted resources. High quality. How is that a problem? Put this in terms of tacos, okay? How many of you like Taco Bell tacos? I assume, the other side of that screen is basically saying, yeah, I don't have a problem with Taco Bell tacos, and stuff like that. But here's the problem. Let's say that we put a price floor on tacos that is $10 a taco, okay? If I have to pay $10 for a taco, that better be a very, very good taco. I am not paying $10 for a Taco Bell taco. But here's the thing. In this kind of world, Taco Bell tacos can't really exist. Sometimes we just want the crappy $2 taco. Sometimes we just want the lower quality product. Because it satisfies our hunger, because it satisfies this, that, any number of things. But sometimes we're ultimately shut out of lower quality goods, and that puts a lot of people out of the market. Low quantity. In this case, we're talking about the amount that's purchased versus how much is produced. We're going to get this problem over here where these guys are going to end up producing over here, but only these guys are ultimately going to end up buying. So it's similar to what we have over here, with a price ceiling. We're going to actually produce here, which means the only quantity available is going to be here. So price ceilings and price floors have the same effect in terms of quantity, actually, bought up in that regard. The last bit is illegal activity. If I'm, a dairy farmer, and I like that price ceiling, price floor on milk, I want to make sure it stays there because technically it benefits me. People buy milk, so I'm going to get that extra money. So I might accidentally, buy a politician or two. It's not a surprise, we're talking about bribery and stuff like that. And yeah, that does happen, where we have corruption in terms of this, because we want to keep these in place. Now, these are just some of the issues that we see with price floors. Why in the world would we ultimately want to have this? Good example of this is minimum wage. Think of this as, instead of a product market, think of this as the market for labor. In other words, the market for workers, okay? So in this case, the supply of workers is essentially workers, laborers. The demand for workers are the employers. Ultimately, employers would love to pay down here. And yes, you do have some producers that are ultimately wanting to work at this price. But ultimately, they can't because we've set a price higher than what the market is willing to bear. So what you end up doing is you see producers, in other words, workers, willing to produce more work than what ultimately businesses are willing to pay for. And so you have this gap, of the surplus. Now that should sound a little strange. For those of you taking macro, pay attention to this part. Because what we're talking about here is a surplus of workers. Versus here, when we talk about shortage, this is a shortage of goods. If we're talking about a surplus of workers, how does that mean? We have extra workers? More specifically, it means we have extra workers, but we don't have enough work for them to do. In other words, this is another way of describing unemployment, specifically structural unemployment, which we'll talk about another time. All right. So understand that, why would we do this? Well, when the minimum wage was first established back in the 30s, the idea was ultimately we didn't want people, that ultimately couldn't afford a house over their head. We wanted to make sure that people could afford to live, with, a house and family, etc. on this end. Now, minimum wage hasn't kept up with that idea from the Great Depression, but that was the original intent. So, does it cause unemployment nowadays, being so low? The answer is yes, but we're not necessarily sure exactly how much. The other part of this in terms of minimum wage is, we're trying to make sure that people have an ability to actually live on this end. So, is it, a problem in terms of efficiency? Yes. But understand, we're not trying to be efficient. The government knows that it's doing this. The government knows that it's introducing some inefficiency into the economy. So why does it do it? They're doing it so people aren't homeless. They're doing it so people can feed their families. In other words, it's not a question of efficiency. It's about equity. It's about governance. There's a term that we talk about early on in economics between positive versus normative economics. Positive economics is the world how it actually is, how we describe it, what's going on. Normative economics is how it should be, what we want the economy to look like. It's the difference between economics versus politics. And that's what this is. The last thing here is quota, okay? Now, Quota is definitely going to show up a lot more in micro than it would be in macro, so just pay attention here. Now, in terms of the body of this, how we read this, in order for a quota to be effective, it has to be below the equilibrium quota, equilibrium quantity. So we're making a quantity less than what the market would want. Now, why would we want to do this? Usually some kind of common resource. Okay, well, what does that mean? How about fish? Fish are a common resource. We go 12.5 miles offshore fishing. Hey, man, that fish is free for everybody on this planet. But what if we were ultimately trying to come up with a quota that minimizes the availability of those fish for everybody? That's the idea. We don't want that resource to run out. So we set a quota. Now, understand there's going to be some parts to this, to walk through. So bear with me. You have the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. That's the market quantity and price in that end. So that's where ultimately the market would be. But we set this quota below, and notice what happens. First off, we're going to cross the supply curve, and that's going to be the supply price. So this is the price that ultimately producers are ultimately going to price their product at. But up here, where the quota is crossing the demand curve, that's the demand price. That's the price that consumers are actually going to pay. Well, where's that coming from? This gap between the demand price and the supply price is known as the quota rent. It's also sometimes referred to as a license fee. And sometimes it's a tax. But generally the idea is essentially the amount of what the quota costs to actually provide the product to the consumer. So what we're going to end up seeing is that the producer is going to charge this price plus the amount of the quota. So this kind of leads to some problems. First, consumers are going to pay a much higher price for this product. And if they're going to pay a much higher price, then we're going to lose ultimately this. These people are not going to have access to it. Similarly, we're going to have a lower quantity. So even though the market is willing to buy at this is what's available. That's actually not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is this triangle right here. Deadweight loss. Okay? Deadweight loss, and we'll talk more about this in micro as we go, but the idea behind it are transactions that should have happened but didn't. And let's just keep that idea in right now. And understand that it's grossly inefficient. It is not the best thing out there, that we see. So in terms of deadweight loss, this is ultimately the amount that consumers are giving up and what producers are giving up. But understand something, unlike before when we were limiting consumers and producers from the market, with shortages and surpluses, understand that these producers and these consumers are technically still in the market. So they're just in this sort of limbo where they want to have the good and also want to sell the good. They just don't have access to it, at least not legally. Okay? And that kind of creates some problems. Okay? Let's use the fish example again. So if we're talking about fish, on this end, think about fishermen. Fishermen face a variety of different problems in terms of costs, in terms of competition, in terms of being paid, any number of things on this end. Not the least of which is they've got to feed their families. If I'm a fisherman, and I'm sitting there, in the Atlantic coast, and I'm trying to, get more and more fish, but I know the fish are getting depleted, I'm going to go further and further out in the ocean. Something else along those lines. I may be very well aware of the quota, but if it comes down to feeding my family, versus, making sure that the fish are going to be, out there for generations to come, that's not a difficult call to make for the individual. And so the individual sometimes, has an incentive to ultimately ignore the quota. And that's a huge problem on one end. But then there's the other problem, okay, in terms of quotas. You have to understand that in order for quotas to work, they have to be agreed on by everybody. So let's assume that, the world got together, created this treaty where we divided up the ocean, into different pieces in some form. This, fishing area belongs to Iceland, this one belongs to Canada, this one belongs to Denmark, and so on, okay? If there are no fish in my region, You think I'm just saying, well, sorry, I guess that belongs to Iceland. I'm not going to go ahead and, fish over there. At the other time, besides the individual fisherman part, the other part of this is actually the governments. Say that I'm, out of Reykjavik and I, have Iceland fishermen that are breaking, the territorial boundaries that we set in terms of fishing rights. And they're going into Canada regularly to fish. It may not be in my best interest politically to stop them. Remember, I'm a politician. I want to get reelected. The last thing I want to do is being, perceived as being cruel to fishermen and their families. So I might accidentally ignore the quota. And this is a real problem. In fact, it's a real problem ultimately when we're talking about price ceilings, price floors, and quotas in general. What you're talking about is essentially some government intervention in the economy. And anytime there is some government intervention in the economy, there is going to be some kind of inefficiency. But governments are always going to have to be about efficiency. Sometimes they're going to have to make the inefficient choice because their idea is ultimately to benefit their populations and to make choices that benefit individuals. And sometimes that comes at the cost of what is, perfectly efficient. And that's the issue. That's it for today. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye.